Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. And contrary to what has been advertised, it's actually Donal Patton as opposed to Joe Patton that's with us today. It's a brother, but I don't know, like, younger brother. That's all I'd say about Joe. I won't say any more about you relative to that in case we upset Joe. So Donal's going to give us a very good detail in relation to the practicalities of spring grazing. I've seen Donal do this with the nutrition course that we do in Teagasc before, and I think he does a really, really good job in just talking about the practicalities of the spring grazing, not necessarily focusing on the percentages, etc., but just how you go about it and how to try and make it work for you, no matter what type of land you're on. And obviously Donal's in Ballyhaise, which isn't Moore Park, obviously, but is doing a very good job in terms of grazing, and actually have done trials of the early spring grazing versus the later turnout as well in the last couple of years too, Donal. So you might be able to maybe touch on that as well a little bit in terms of how it's impacted on performance. So I'll just hand over to you, so to go through your presentation. It'll be short enough today, 20 minutes to half an hour, depending on the number of questions that we have, and we'd encourage you to throw in the questions on the Q&A, and myself and Donal will answer them as we go. So, right, Donal, fire away. Thanks.
That's fine. You can see the screen there, Stuart.
Yeah, all is good. Yeah.
No, that's fine. So look at, I suppose, as Stuart has said, really the idea of this presentation is really just for lads. Look at it, it's a busy time of year, so just a quick, 20-minute presentation, and just to talk around, I suppose, the stuff that we're all battling with for the next number of weeks in terms of getting cows out. Getting cows out to grass and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose, look, we're not going to talk a lot in terms of the big picture stuff. It's more day to day. Most of this is focused on the actual day to day kind of thing. Just the first slide we'll just look at the first rotation, but apart from that, it's pretty much day to day. So I suppose, look at in terms of, this is kind of the way I always think of it in my head, in terms of, there's choices to make, decisions to make day to day in terms of, getting the cows out, what you feed them, is there silage going in, is there meal going in, is there grass going in, to what level? And it's, to be honest, it's a balancing act. So we're trying to, set the farm up correctly in the first round, but we're also trying to make sure the cow is well fed, healthy, and heading for a good peak in terms of production. So the 1, 2, 3 in my mind, these are the kind of the 3 points, or the priorities really. So priority number 1 is feed the cow. The cow has to be well fed, not just fed, just be well fed every day, and she has to be on a rising plane of nutrition. So that's number 1 priority, come what may. Otherwise that has to happen every day. 2 then is, I suppose, look at, we're trying to, as much as we possibly can, minimize the amount of poaching that we're doing by doing that. And then I suppose the 3rd point then is trying to achieve residuals and graze outs. And look, at sometimes we have to accept that we're not going to reach the target residual all the time, to make sure that 1 and 2 points there are covered. So look at the first slide here really is just a sort of a broad look in terms of the first rotation. So first rotation, look at it, 60 days pretty much, regardless where you are in the country. So for some people that's starting early February and finishing early April. Us up this neck of the woods, it's more so mid-February, finishing mid-April. So I've just kind of split it down into 3 sections, the first 20 days, second 20 days, and then the last 20 days. So really what the focus is across that 60-day period. So the first third of that period, really, in my mind, what we're basically trying to do is we're trying to get through area. And look, you'll hear people harping on that all the time, and getting 30% grazed by the 1st of March or the 10th of March, depending on the part of the country you're in or the type of farm you're on. But it makes perfect sense, because doing that is what sets you up for the start of the second rotation. So that, look, it sounds simple. We get through 30% in the first, in that first third. In reality, it's quite difficult to do, depending on the situation of the farm. So look at, if you've got guys with split calving patterns, or very early calving or very heavy stocking rates, actually they'll have no problem achieving that. If you're calving fairly close to your, turnout date, and you're in, we'll call it a normal enough sort of a stocking rate, 2.5 to 3 cows to the hectare on the milking platform, then getting through the first third is actually quite a struggle in terms of area. So the things we look at there is we try to minimize the silage as much as we can. I suppose that the third point there is second graze in a day. That's a thing that people, which is understandable. People struggle maybe to get the cows out at night, even if they are getting them out during the day. And if you're not getting them out for a second bout of grazing, basically, it's nigh on impossible to get to that 30%. But on top of all that, we're trying to manage the cows at the most delicate period. So in that first 20 days, you have a lot of heifers calved. You know, you have a good chunk of or everything that's going out basically on most farms is freshly calved cows. So actually managing that transition, you know, a cow that's after going through the stress of calving, then you're taking her from an all silage diet and trying to put her out to grass. So that's a tricky enough thing to do. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. The middle third then, in terms of, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't say the first third. I would say I wouldn't be that worried about walking the farm every week. You know, you get an open and cover done, and then you just follow your area, try and get through as much area as possible. The second or the middle segment there, it's, you know, you have to start measuring a bit more regularly, once a week if you can, and focusing in on the budget and seeing where am I actually in terms of, you know, where I should be. Have I gone way, you know, is grass cover dropping too quick? Is it higher than I expected? And if silage has to go in to stretch things, my preference is actually to do it there in the middle, not what happens on most farms, which is everybody, you know, they struggle in the first third, then they go hammer and tongs in the second third, and then they have to pull the brake up, you know, towards the end of the first rotation. My preference is actually to put silage in that middle segment, if at all possible. Now, it is a little bit of a guessing game. And the reason why I prefer to put it in there is more to do with the cow, I suppose. The cow's at a different stage. I would like towards the end, or the last 20 days, that basically the cow's on, you know, meal and silage, or meal and grass, full grass diet, and she's, you know, heading into that second round, getting as well fed as she possibly can. So that's kind of it in terms of the 3/3 of the first rotation. What we're trying to do, get through the area, measure more regularly, shove in silage here if it needs to go in the middle, and then that we're on all grass and whatever little bit of meal is going in or whatever towards the end of the first round, that we're heading into the second rotation.
So Donal, your point there, I suppose, is that you start off maybe in second gear, you're building up along through the gears, and you're maybe dropping back into third for the middle third of it there, so that you can be in fifth gear in the last period, rather than having to drop down again. Like.
Just the experience, or my experience going around on farms and stuff, Stuart, and you probably see it yourselves. And you know, we've probably all made that mistake where we're the eternal optimists here in mid to late March, and we think, you know, it's going to come. It's going to come. We'll keep going. We'll fly on. And then we get to the 10th of April and our farm cover is going to drop through the floor and we have to shove in a lot of silage. From my point of view, for the cow, it's the wrong time to do that. I have no problem in doing it in March if it has to be done, but I hate to do it. I'm not saying I haven't done it. I have done it, and I don't like it. I hate doing it in April. So basically, I suppose that you're following the budget, Stuart, and if silage has to go in, you know, make the call early, put it in here in the middle, that by the time you sort of hit, you know, the last 10 or 15 days of your first rotation, it's all grass, and they're heading into their second round, you know, basically going on an all grass diet. So they're going to hit peak in a better position, I suppose.
Yeah, and I suppose it makes life a little bit easier. And as you said, like, geez, we're all hoping that you could get away with it, but in reality, like, you're in that zone of kind of maybe feeding silage to other stock still at that stage in March.
Yes,
anyway.
that, and as well as that, we'll talk about it in the next slide, Stuart. You know, in this middle sector, I know it doesn't always work out this way, but generally speaking, here in the middle, you know, the first and the middle third, conditions are usually that, but, you know, soil moisture is just a little bit higher. Grazing conditions are usually a little bit more difficult. So, you know, why not use that kind of to your advantage? So silage has to go in, put it in here when it's easier to do, I suppose, in a way that, you know, what I hate to do is on the 10th of April be feeding silage when the grazing conditions are good. I'm just doing it because I let things go too far here, or I didn't get through enough area in the first third.
Yeah, okay.
Basically. Yeah.
Okay.
So look, I suppose back to our 3 points. So point number 1 is, you know, feed the cow. The cow has to be well fed every day, and she has to be getting a little bit more today than she got yesterday. I suppose that's the kernel of it, and that's what we're trying to do. So in terms of grazing and putting grass into the diet, you know, we talk a lot about the reduction in feed costs, and it does have, it has a pretty big reduction or big effect on feed costs. So the trial that Stuart mentioned there, where we had cows in Ballyhaise over the last 4 years, we basically had cows turned out sort of mid-February versus cows turned out mid-March. During that period, when some were in the shed and some were in the paddock, you know, the cows in the paddock were getting sort of 3 kilos of a 14% nut. The cows in the shed were getting 7 kilos of an 18% nut, and production was pretty much the same during that period. So we've all learned that, I suppose, in years like 13, years like 2013 or 2012 or 2018, where we don't have the grass and we have to replace it with other feeds. It's quite expensive. The thing we probably don't spend enough time talking about is actually the effect it has on, the cow's diet. So it's not just about reducing feed costs. It's actually, as well about that, it's about feeding the cow better. So a lot of people talk about, we need to feed the cow really well. And in their minds, that means, extra concentrates or whatever. But actually getting more grass in there, if the grazing conditions are good, getting more grass in there has a big, big impact. So we know it's going to increase the energy, which is a big limiting factor, the energy and protein. But the last point there, the intake potential, that's probably something we don't talk that much about. So basically, if you take a grazing diet versus a silage diet, you're going to get that extra intake potential, maybe, a kilo or whatever of extra intake of forage. And that's what really drives on the production. And you'll see that the guys that are doing a good job on that, when they get up to peak, they're sitting at 2 kilos plus of solids then when they're hitting peak. So it's actually by getting the grass in, you're feeding the cow better. It's not just about getting the feed costs down. And I suppose the third point there, my approach is, and even we'll say in that middle third, if silage has to go in, which it does have to go in, some years or a good few years, I suppose. My approach is, look, we get some grass in every day. So it's not that we stop grazing and we pull off altogether. Look, that can happen if it gets particularly bad, but really the thing is that we're trying to get some grass in every day, and really the decision should be, when do I bring them in, not do I put them out. So look, if they go out every day, if I have to bring them in after 2 hours, so be it, but they're going out, as many days as we possibly can. And one little practical thing I would say on that is that, oftentimes you'll see where people will make that call before they start milking in the morning. So they'll go out, slash and rain, put them in the shed, and then you finish milking, you finish feeding the calves. A couple of hours later, the sun is shining, but the cows are lying down with a belly full of silage. So what I would sort of say to guys is, look, do your milking, let the cows stand in the collecting yard if you're not sure, get your jobs done, and then you can have a look around you and say, well, actually, it's not that bad. I will chance them out, or if it's really bad, right, and they have to go in, they have to go in. But it's to delay a decision, because oftentimes, actually an hour and a half later, it doesn't look as bad. So the effect then, I suppose, of early grazing on cow nutrition. So that's one of the things, that first third, that first 30% or 40%, the effect that getting out and grazing that has actually on feeding the cow, 50 or 60 days later. So this if you're in discussion groups or whatever going around, and you see the guys that do a good job in first rotation grazing, you'll see it then when those lads hit second, third, fourth rotations. The cows are humming, they're getting into good quality grass, and they have no problem grazing them out. It's not that they have to be forced to graze them out, in the second, third, fourth rotation. And it was one of the things in our trial where we were looking at a delayed turnout, or well, it wasn't a delayed, it was what's average for our region, which is sort of mid-March, but delayed for us. When we looked at that, it was actually the effect it had on us in April, May. And we were pretty aggressive about trying to sort it out, but it probably took us up until late May, early June before we had those systems back on track, I suppose. So it's the effect that getting the grazing done early actually has on your second and third round is a big thing. And the last point there is in terms of silage, if silage has to go in. So look at, if silage has to go into the diet, there's a number of different ways of doing it. So what some people will do is, and we'll just take an example of, you can afford to give the cows 10 kilos of grass, you're short, we'll say 3 kilos of forage, and you need to get 3 kilos of silage in. So look at, it's what some people will do, and I would have done this myself in the past, they'll try and feed a small bit of silage to every cow every day. So it generally, that approach seems to work better on dry farms. We would tend to take a different approach. So instead of feeding 3 kilos for 7 days, we'll just feed 7 kilos for 3 days. So basically what we'll do is we'll pick our days or nights to go out. So basically, if there's 7 kilos, we'll sort of say, right, what's the 3 wettest nights this week? And we'll hold the cows in. And that, it sorts out the silage going in terms of the feed budget, but it leaves the grazing, I find, an awful lot easier to do it that way. So it's kind of whatever suits yourself. The last one there then, I suppose, is what some people will do, maybe in that situation towards the end of the first rotation where they need to slow the thing for a week or 10 days. You know, grazing conditions are fine outside. Maybe all the cows calved, cubicle accommodation is a little bit tight, or feed space is a little bit tight. What some people will do is they'll hold in, you know, the last 2 or 3 rows of cows and do that on rotation. So that's probably the best option I would find for when you have a lot of cows calved and grazing conditions are good, is actually to pull off, you know, 2, 3 rows or whatever you need to do to reduce your demand enough. The cows in the shed aren't under pressure. The cows in the field are getting the same allocation, and there's no, I suppose, upset in terms of the daily routine. There's no bringing cows in the middle of the day to get silage. So it's kind of whichever one suits your own particular situation, really. So that's the feeding the cow part of it. The second point then is, look at minimizing the poaching. So this is drilled into us all fairly early on, you know, not to poach ground, and maybe more so the lads on heavier soil types, which is understandable because maybe they don't, heavier clay soils won't recover as quickly. But I suppose the first thing is, and this would be more not for the experienced guys going to grass, they kind of know this anyway, but maybe for new entrants or people starting out or trying to pull their grazing season, you know, or the turnout date back a few weeks than what it normally would be. I suppose the first thing is you don't panic on the first day. So what I would generally do with guys is I'd say to them, right, we're going out on Monday and we're going to keep going till Friday. Give them an end point. So we're going to keep going till Friday and we'll see how we go, no matter what happens on day 1 or 2. Because day 1 or 2 is always that little bit, cows are, you know, a lot of heifers calved and they'll do a lot of jumping around and can do a little bit more damage. So I suppose that's the first thing. The second thing is, look at flexibility, go where you can when you can. And look at people always talk about, you know, go to the dry paddocks when it's wet. I would always think about it more so the other way, that you go to the wet paddocks when it's dry. So for us, and it's, look at Ballyhaise, any people who've been there sort of know that it's quite a mix. There's some good dry land in it, and then there's some quite heavy ground in it. So for us, the big focus is actually on, you know, when it's dry, it's what we do when it's dry, not what we do when it's wet. When it's wet, we're limited on what we can do. It's actually where do we go when it's dry. So that's getting those areas. Now that could be area that's heavy ground, or it could also be maybe parts of the farm that aren't as well set up for grazing in terms of infrastructure. You know, when it's dry, maybe try and get those areas pulled off if you can. The on-off grazing, look at, I did a quick look back at the records for the last 4 years, and pretty much the differential between the cows going out in February and the cows going out in March was on-off grazing. So we do somewhere between 25 and 30 days on-off grazing in the spring. And generally speaking, the way we would operate is that, look, at just until the thing settles, so usually up until the 10th of March, they're just on-off grazed at night. Just come in at night, pretty much regardless. In terms of, look, at it makes the thing simple. Cows come back in, and during the day, then we can make when the lads are there, they can make the call whether to bring them in or not. If it's a good, fine day, they'll leave them out. If they need to come in after the few hours, they can do so. So look, it's a great tool to use. I think lads probably need a little bit of help with it to try and get it to work right. You know, going back to our first point of making sure the cow is well fed. Look, it's one thing on-off grazing for 3 or 4 days, but if you're doing like what we're doing, or lads on heavier ground where we're doing it consistently right through maybe the first 30 or 40 days or whatever it is, we have to be really careful in terms of the cow being well fed. So look at the silage thing. Personally, it doesn't bother me that much if silage has to be fed. We would do a little bit of that ourselves. We'll feed 1 kilo to 2 kilos dry matter of silage in the shed when the cows come in at night, and we don't find it as a problem. and we do that, I suppose, partly because we have quite a long interval at night. And it's just to make sure that the cow has been well fed. Some people will do that, you know, they'll able to do that. I suppose if you've got diet feeders or that in the system, people can measure out that quite easily. If you're feeding bales or blocks of silage, it's a little bit harder to do. So maybe what some people will do is they'll do it on a time basis rather than measuring the feed out. So they'll give them an hour's access to silage or 2 hours access to silage after the cows come in and close them back. Look, I suppose the big thing is if silage is going in, it has to be done in a measured way. If you give them full access to silage, basically the next grazing, they're going to do very little. So if you're doing it, do it in a measured way, I suppose. The 4th point there in terms of 12-hour breaks, look, it's a very basic thing. I would see it out in farm where people will say, no, I can't, look, they're doing too much damage, I have to stop grazing. You go out to see them and they're grazing two grazings or 3 grazings in the one area. So it's a very basic thing, but it's probably a thing that's, you know, some people aren't doing consistently. Basically, first rotation, pretty much it's 12-hour breaks the whole way through for us. Now, I know lads on drier land can get away without that, and that's fine. But if you're on anyway sort of normal to tricky land, I would say 12-hour breaks pretty much right the way through the first rotation, unless it's exceptionally dry. The other thing I suppose on that is that the tendency is, so when you run into these really difficult periods of like just constant rain or very, very wet periods, the tendency with lads is actually to give more area when it's wet. And I would go the opposite way. I would actually tighten the area, I give them a smaller area, pull them off quicker, and then feed a little bit of silage when they come in if you have to do it. I think when you do that, it's very surprising. So basically, you know, you may, instead of allocating 7 kilos of grass, you only allocate 5 kilos of grass, pull them off after 2 hours and give them a couple of kilos of silage when they go in. Look at, okay, there's a bit of silage going into the diet, but at least they've got the 5 kilos of grass in. Whereas if you said, no, it's too wet, no grass is going into the diet. So that actually works quite well, I find, in the really difficult conditions, you know, the days when you're questioning should you be out or not, and you'll get away without doing much damage at all. In terms of, yeah, go ahead.
Just the 12-hour breaks on an ongoing basis, we'll say you're saying there for maybe 20, 30, 40 days. Are you giving access to water all the time, or are you, what way do you deal with, or what do you think about the water?
It'll depend. Yeah, look at, we talked about feeding the cow. Look at no more than any of the rest of us, Stuart. Number one part of nutrition is actually water. So the cow has to get water. If we're on-off grazing, so conditions are difficult, and I think that's where people get caught with it. You know, you don't want to let cows back over bare ground to get the water, so that's fine. If we're on-off grazing, I don't worry about access to water in the paddock. So we have, you know, we have access to water actually in the collecting yard, and there's good drinkers in the sheds with good flow into them. So basically, if they're only going out for 2 or 3 hours, coming back in, and they've got a drink of water directly after milking, and they're going to get water when they come back in, I wouldn't be too worried about it. Now, if we're given 12-hour breaks and they're staying out full time, they need access to water in whatever way you can do that. Yeah.
But the flip there is that if they're staying out, the chances are they can actually go back over a bit of
Correct,
ground.
Exactly. So you can be a little bit more, we'll say, easy going in terms of giving them access. So if they're staying out, that's exactly the point. If they're staying out, usually ground conditions is good enough to let them stay out, and look at you drop your wire and you can let them back over bare area to get the water. I suppose in terms of the night grazings for that first few weeks, we just find that look at, by not having to make the decision, I've often seen it where you sort of say, it's not too bad. We leave them out tonight. You go out the next morning and it's damaged because just a shower of rain came at 6 o'clock in the morning or whatever, and they'd done more damage in that last 20 minutes than they did the whole 10 hours beforehand. So we just find when ground conditions is so, it's just easier to just say, right, come in after 3 hours. Now, obviously, for lads on good dry ground, they don't need to do that. But for us, we just find that we do that, it's actually, we'll get away with doing an awful lot less damage across that first 30, 40 days. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're just in that zone, basically, a bit like the mid third that you're saying there. You're happy to feed the silage. You just stick to the principles of take them off.
Yes, and I suppose
let them lie down inside.
Yeah, for people with maybe that they're not doing it all themselves and there's staff on the farm and stuff, it just takes a layer of decision making out of it. Look at to come in, if you've got the facilities, look at to come in, and that's it. And it's a sort of a routine, and that's just the way it's done. The I suppose maybe I didn't mention it there is evening milking time is a big driver of that. So in situations where people are milking late in the evenings, which does definitely in this part of the world, it happens. Um, Basically, the cows need to be going back to grass at sort of 5 o'clock that you can bring them in at 8. If they're not going back at 8 o'clock, nobody's going to ask somebody to go out and bring cows in at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night. So evening milking time has a bit of a big effect actually on that, like whether it's going to
Donal,
be
just out of interest now, your thoughts on you said there, if you're not going day and night in February, it's hard to achieve the target. But we'll say if a person is on their own and they're obviously maybe dependent on a bit of help in the evening time and they are milking that bit later, is there a way that they can still try to achieve their 25 or 30% by maybe going for that little bit lower cover on an ongoing basis throughout the month of February? Or
absolutely, yeah. And as look, I didn't mention it there, but yes, if you're trying to get through area, and to be honest, you probably have to do that anyway, Stuart, even if you are getting out for the extra grazing. And I suppose that's on a farm by farm basis. You look at it and you'll say, well, actually, look at this guy's heavily stocked, or he's calving quite early. He's going to fly through. He can out by day. He's going to hit his target. For other people, when you're in a situation where you're calving closer to grass, it's more of a challenge. So definitely, yes, go into your lighter covers, which you probably need to be doing anyway. From getting the cow grazing point of view, that's a big help. It definitely gets you through more area. Absolutely. So look at just on the last point there on poaching, in terms of what's acceptable, and look at it's hard to do it in a forum like this. We did a bit of measuring in terms of actually poaching in Ballyhaise, and there's been a good bit of stuff done in Salahead on it over the years. James Humphreys would have done a lot of work on it. So when you look at what's acceptable from a growth point of view, look at moderate poaching once during the spring has zero impact on growth. And we saw that. So we had, as I say, we had a group of cows that were out 30 days earlier in spring and maybe 20 days later in autumn. So by the law of averages, we were going to do more, we were grazing in more difficult conditions, and it had zero impact on growth. So from a growth perspective, look at that moderate amount of poaching done early, done once in the spring. It's a different thing if it happens twice in a row or second rotation. That's a different prospect. But in the spring, it's not really a problem. Now, the environmental one is one that there's a bit of a question mark around. We haven't done measure, or when we were doing our trial, we didn't do environmental measures. But some people would be asking the questions in terms of overland flow of pee and stuff like that, particularly on heavier soil. So that's something where, we have to be a little bit more careful on, I suppose. But from a growth perspective, basically that moderate amount of poaching. And when you see moderate poaching, when it's measured in terms of actually going to measure it, most farmers would look at that as worse than moderate, if you know what I'm saying. So it's just something we're trying to minimize it as much as we can, but small bits and pieces of it's going to happen across the spring. We just try and minimize it as much as we can. So I suppose the last point then really is the residual. So we're trying to, the cow's been well fed. We're minimizing the amount of poaching we're doing, and then the last thing is trying to graze the farm out well. So from the point of view, and Stuart's after mentioning it there, of where you actually start grazing, the covers you go into, that's a big driver of it. So look at going into your 1,000 covers clean and green. So as much as the actual cover on the paddock, it's what it looks like. So clean, green to the base, they're the type of covers that cows will start off well on, they'll graze them out well. And if you can get that first batch of 20 or 30 cows into the routine of grazing out well, every cow that adds in after that, it's much easier to train her. So getting that right at the start does set you up, and it makes the thing work well. So the thing is, I suppose, and we mentioned it there earlier on, look, if you get the residuals right in the first rotation, it's going to set you up for following rotations. But it is a balance, and getting it wrong it'll suppress production. So if you look back and look at all the stuff that has been done, and there's been a number of trials done on this in Moore Park over the years, the targets are targets for a reason. So we kind of know at this stage where we need to go. So it's somewhere between 3.5 and 4 centimeters in the first round, and then you can relax back a little bit to 4.5 from the rounds later on than that. So if we go too tight, so we, and this is probably something that I would have done when I was starting off, I would have been completely focused on residual. So you're nailing it to 3 and 3.5 all the time. If you do that, basically you're going to suppress production in the cow. So she's not going to reach peak. And if you look back at your own figures on your own farm, if you're not hitting that 2 kilos of solids peak and maintaining it for a number of weeks, maybe that's something to look into. Are you actually pushing the thing too hard in that first round? Is everything perfectly grazed out all the time, but the cows are a kilo and a half short in terms of intake? So if you go too tight, you're going to suppress production. But if you go the opposite way and you go too lax, it's going to suppress production in a different way. So in second, third rotations, there's going to be more dead material at the base of the sward, and basically the cow can't get intake at that stage. So the targets are targets for a reason. It's because lots and lots and lots of trials have been done on it. And instead of arguing it, we probably should just try and get to it as many days as we possibly can. One of the things I would say that I would do would be to look at, as a rule, just over allocate once a week. So if you're in a situation, or if if you're doing the thing of actually going out and allocating on a kilo per head per day basis, just once a week, we'll say on a Monday or Tuesday, or pick your day, you say, right, that's half a hectare. So today, the book says half a hectare, I'm going to give them 0.6 or 0.7 just today and see what happens. If you over allocate and the cows nail it, well, then go up again and keep going up until the residual rises a little bit. It's just a way of guarding against pushing the cows too hard. And you do it once a week. If you do it and the residual is 5 or 5.5 or 6 centimeters, you go back to your book value. It's just a sort of it's a check on yourself, because at the end of the day, where most people are putting, whether they're eyeballing or whatever, it's not an exact science in terms of putting the cover on a paddock. We could be 100, we could be 200 out. So by doing this, the cow is going to tell us whether we're right or we're wrong. And then I suppose the last point then is, look at residual. It's a funny thing. In my mind, it's probably the easiest thing to measure. If you're out with discussion groups or that, and you look at pasture base, everybody grazes to 50 all the time. But when you go out to farm, it's anywhere from 0.50 to plus 300 in reality. So it's probably a thing within discussion groups, even at meetings, taking the plate. If there is one member of the group has a plate meter, or if you have a friend has a plate meter, maybe the odd time across the spring, they actually come and say, you're thinking in your head, this is well grazed out. Get them to measure it, because the great thing about the plate meter measuring residuals is there's no ambiguity really with it. It is what it is. So it's probably something we do need to look a bit tighter on and measure a bit more often, I suppose.
Okay, very good, Donal. Really. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions there now, and because they were I knew that they were coming up in the presentation, a small bit I didn't bring them in at the time, but 2 questions. The first one is, how do you measure out the amount of grass for a 12-hour break? And the reason I didn't ask that is because of your your point about the over allocation, but you can answer that in a second. And then the other one is, how do you manage the grazing residuals in that middle third when you're feeding silage?
So look, I suppose the first thing is, right, the measuring out the area. It's probably not the forum to do it here, Stuart, I suppose, in terms of look at it. You just
hard to describe it, like.
Yeah, it's hard to describe it. It's something that if you don't know how to do, well, I suppose the first thing I'll say is that there's a new addition to the app, to the PBI app, if you're using it, where there's actually an allocation calculator included now, where basically you can put in the cover on the paddock, how many cows are going in to the paddock, how much grass are given them, and it'll work out then how many grazings you're going to get, and you can put in your the length of the fence, and it'll tell you where to put the wire. It's, to be honest with you, it's not for here, because we could be 20 minutes talking about it. It's something, if you don't know how to do it, fine, get onto your advisor, get onto someone in your group, and actually figure that it'll take a bit of time to figure that. I know from doing it with students and farmers and stuff, it's one of them things that takes a wee bit of time. And even if you do know how to do it, it's all predicated on the cover you put in there being right and the intake of the cow you put into the calculation being right. And either of those things could be 10 or 15% up or down. So that's where the over allocation, even if we know exactly how to do the sum and we know exactly how to set up the allocation, if I put the wrong cover on the paddock, or I underestimated the amount of cows eaten, or overestimated, that could be a little bit out. So that's where this over allocation once a week comes in. The second question then, Stuart.
Yeah, it was just how you're managing the residual with the silage going in the middle.
The residual with the silage going in is one that always comes up. I've never seen it as a major problem, and that's probably a little bit against what a lot of people would say. I found, just if I flick back here, I found when I was doing this, feeding some every day, I found it an absolute nightmare to get them to graze out properly. And that was because when you're doing that, there's a couple of things, I suppose. The first thing is, measuring out the amount of silage that you're feeding in real terms, how accurate are you going to be? The second thing is, when do you feed it? Do you feed it after milking? Do you feed it before milking? Do you bring them in early? Well, we tried it every way, and we used to try and do was bring them in, an hour before milking. When we were doing that, what we found was it broke the whole routine of the farm up. Cows became unsettled. If you put them into a paddock and there was, a wettish day and there was a little bit of grass left on the paddock, but they knew there was going to be silage in the shed, they would stand and absolutely roar at you. So that's why we moved to this second way of doing things. And from that point of view, I don't find it having a major impact on residual. The one thing, I suppose, a little trick to it is, if we'll say we're going to house them on Friday and Saturday night, well, then your Saturday and Sunday allocations maybe tighten the back up a kilo or 2 kilos on the grass. Just, you know what I mean, that if they're getting a full allocation of silage at night, when they're going out, you just tighten them up a little bit on the grass and they will graze out quite well. But when we were doing this up here, it definitely had a bigger impact, I think, on the residual.
So there's a level of expectation of the cow, which
yes, it's behaviour. It's probably behaviour more than anything else, Stuart, and it's really hard to account for. And when you go out the road on the quad, they all come shouting at
straight away.
So I just find this here with either the second or third option there, when the cows are in, they're in, and when they're out, they're out. And if they're out, their allocation of grass until for the 3 hours or until the next milking, and they kind of know that, and they're much more settled. The last one there works really well from that point of view. Actually, the cows that'll be shouting on this one is the ones maybe that'll be in the shed, but because they've got loads of room and silage in front of them, it's not a major issue. So that would be my experience of it. Just the little tip is, just if you're given 6 kilos of grass a day, tighten them maybe to 4 for the days after that they've been in at night.
And in the last case there, Donal, you're after ambushing them because they're actually expecting to get grass, and next thing they're turned into the shed. Correct. The last couple of rows. Now, and as you said, I suppose just to clarify that as well, when you're saying on rotation, you mean basically that you turn in the cows that are in the shed and leave them be milked first, then the next time.
Yes, if you can do that. If you can do that, I know a chap in one of the groups I'd be involved with there. The way he was doing it, he had an automatic drafting system, and the way he did it, he basically set up group 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll say the 100 cows, and he pulled 25 cows off per milking to slow them up enough. Well, basically what he did is look at group 1 this morning, group 2 this evening, 3 tomorrow morning, 3 tomorrow evening. So basically every cow in the herd was getting 3 grazings and a bout of silage, 3 grazings and a bout of silage. Yeah. And that's, if you have a drafter, that's probably the best way to do it. If you don't, exactly what you say, run the cows that's in the shed in first, let them on to the field, and then the last 2 rows hold for the shed. But there probably will be a bit of overlap on that, no matter how you do it. But it's just that, in my mind, that's the one that you use towards the end of the first rotation, where cubicle space, accommodation, stuff like that's getting tight in the yard. And the other thing about that, but grazing conditions are good. The other thing about that from a labour point of view is, we'd say for that guy, he only has to clean 30 cubicles, if you get what I'm saying. Yeah. And he can put silage in a small enough area. He's not trying to spread it out over a big area. So that works really well. That's sort of for the third, if you get what I'm saying, of the first rotation, and the middle one there is what we would use in March if there's a chunk of silage to go in.
Okay, and then the third question then is, what concentrate supplementation would you recommend for heavy ground farm where cows could be on off for a week and then back indoors the following week?
Yeah, well, look, we would have always gone with sort of 3 kilos of a 14% nut. Last year, we upped that a little bit and we went to 4 kilos of a 16%. Now, look at, on book value, Stuart, it says their need for the 16%. We just found, and we were happy enough with the way the cows they got to a bit of a better peak and went up a little bit in production and stuff. Now, it's hard to know, was it all down to that, I suppose. But I suppose the way I look at it is it's erring a little bit on the side of caution. If, as the person who asked the question sort of saying, they're obviously on a similar type farm, they understand the story. If you're on off grazing for long periods of time, if you're if there's, you know, the reality is there's going to be silage in and out and stuff like that. To me, sort of somewhere around 3 to 4 kilos of a 16 nut for that first sort of 40 to 60 days, and then you can drop back to your 12 or 14% nut at that stage.
And the other bit of advice I give there as well, Donal, is I suppose feed companies mightn't like me enough for this month maybe, but like only buy small loads at this stage of the year.
Because it can change quick.
Flexibility. Don't have a bin full of something that isn't going to be appropriate for you in 2 weeks' time.
That's very true. Yeah, it can
actually,
change.
In one sense,
quick.
When you talk to some of the lads in the feed companies, they nearly prefer it rather than coming out with big loads to one farm. They can pick off a couple of smaller loads to a couple of farms, so they're happier maybe in that sense. So maybe depending on the scale of the herd, like you'll be talking maybe 4 ton loads is probably going to be your minimum. Just get 4 ton. If it lasts you a week or a fortnight, then you can make the decision then what you need the next time round. But I suppose your point, Donal, is that a bit like the grass and the protein element of it, you're erring on making sure that they have just enough protein.
I suppose if you've got 16% crude, if you've got 16% protein silage and, you know, you've got good quality grass, and you'd sort of ask the question. But I think on a lot of farms out there, you know, the reality is getting silage to match up, as in that you always have the good quality silage left for spring and all this sort of stuff. Like sometimes people end up having to put silage in March, and it mightn't be 16% crude protein, if you know what I'm saying. So I think, look at, unless everything is perfect, I would say, look at 16%. It's no big deal for that first few loads, and then you can drop back to your 14 then.
Yeah. Very good. So I suppose to sum it up, so graze when you can, where you can, when you can. Think about more getting them out rather than keeping them in, and bring them in quicker than if the conditions aren't favourable really. And maybe look at some of the points that are up there at the bottom of the slide. So you have the options of feeding some silage every day, but you're going to have to be careful when you're allocating in that scenario. On the heavier farms, you're recommending to maybe just decide to stay in on particular nights during the week when you know it's going to be that much trickier. And then we'll say for later in the period of time, we're talking about maybe rotating if tight on space or whatever. But the objective is to get that 25-30% grazed. I suppose we always talk about the 1st of March, but like it's very hard for Donal and myself to give generic advice in relation to that. Depending on the farm, it's going to be maybe the 1st of March, or maybe the 10th of March on the heavier soils. So just, I suppose, talk to your own local advisor in relation to your what's appropriate for your farm, and that could vary even within the regions that advisors are dealing with, what's appropriate for individuals' farms. But the objective is to try and get some ground, a nice bit of ground grazed in February in order to have that good quality grass coming back in early April, which is going to, as Donal said, drive on that production from the 2 kilos of milk solids up to the 2.5 possibly, and also have cows primed for breeding. So there's there's a lot going on in this spring period, obviously, between cows calving, calves, and trying to get the grass right. But if you can just, I suppose, implement some of the stuff that Donal has suggested there, it actually makes it easier, and it's not as onerous a task. Like, I mean, as Donal said, there's no need to be out walking every week during this stage of the year, but just try to do a good job on grazing out as you go along, because it'll set you up nicely for the rest of the year. So I suppose we'll leave it at that. Thanks a million, Donal, for that. As I said, I love the practical nature of your talk in relation to this all the time, and hopefully people that are listening in have gotten something good from it. We wish you all the best for the week, and we'll see you again next week. So thanks very much.